The waiter stopped mid-step, eyes hard, voice flat, refusing service in a crowded Harlem restaurant. Every man at the table expected blood. Because humiliation like that usually demanded violence immediately, the plate never reached the table. It hovered between the waiter's hands, white knuckles tight, as if the weight of it might expose something he was trying to hide. The room had already quieted in that way Harlem rooms did, chairs still, voices lowering, eyes pretending not to see while seeing everything. Bumpy Johnson did not look up. He sat straight. Coat pressed, hat placed carefully beside him, hands folded as though this moment had been scheduled. The men with him felt the shift before the words were spoken. They knew the rhythm of the insult. They knew the way the air thickened just before. Violence decided to arrive. "I'm sorry," the waiter said. His voice was practiced, flat, rehearsed in advance. "We don't serve your kind." The words did not echo. They did not need to. They landed and stayed. A chair scraped somewhere behind them. Someone near the window stopped chewing. Outside, traffic passed as usual, unaware that a line had just been crossed inside a restaurant that pretended to be neutral ground. Every head at the table turned toward Bumpy. This was the moment men expected fists, knives, overturned tables. This was how these stories usually began and ended. A refusal became a fight. A fight became a headline. A headline became an excuse. Bumpy Johnson remained still. He lifted his eyes slowly, not to the waiter, but to the owner standing near the register. The owner had positioned himself there deliberately, close enough to be seen, far enough to avoid responsibility. His apron was clean. His smile was tight. His confidence came from habit, not courage. "You heard him," the owner said. Not loud, not quiet, certain. Bumpy studied him the way a chess player studies a board that already favors him. He took in the man's posture, the way his weight leaned backward, the subtle calculation in his eyes. This was not rage. This was routine. This was a man accustomed to disrespect without consequence. Bumpy nodded once, that single motion unsettled the table more than any threat would have. His men exchanged brief looks. They knew that nod. It meant the moment was being stored, not spent. Bumpy reached into his pocket and placed money on the table. Not rushed, not dramatic. Enough to cover what they had ordered, even what they had not received. It was an old rule with him. Never let disrespect turn you into the thing they expect. The waiter hesitated, then set the plate back down behind the counter. The owner's eyes followed the money, then returned to Bumpy's face. Searching for something defiant to latch onto, he found nothing. Bumpy rose. The room rose with him, not physically, but in attention. His chair slid back quietly. He put on his coat, adjusted his cuffs, lifted his hat. Only then did he speak. "You got a nice place here," he said calmly. "Would be a shame if people stopped feeling welcome." The words were gentle, almost polite. That was what made them dangerous. The owner scoffed. "Plenty of people feel welcome," he replied. "The right people." Bumpy held his gaze for a second longer than necessary. Not as a challenge, as a measurement. Then he turned away. The walk to the door felt longer than it was. Each step carried expectation. Someone would move. Someone would say something. Someone would make an ugly dot no one did. Outside, Harlem breathed again. The street smelled of food carts and cold pavement. Life continued, unaware that it had just been asked a question. Bumpy stopped on the sidewalk. His men gathered instinctively, forming a loose shape around him, waiting for instruction that did not come. "Go on," Bumpy said softly. "Get home. Eat." They hesitated. "This ain't finished," one of them muttered. Bumpy allowed himself the smallest smile. "Nothing ever is." He walked alone for a block before a familiar voice called his name. An older man, a grocer from down the street, stood in his doorway, concern etched deep into his face. "You all right?" the man asked. Bumpy nodded. "Aye." "Hem." The grocer glanced toward the restaurant, then back at Bumpy. "That man don't know who he talking to." Bumpy's voice was even. "He knows enough." Word travels fast in Harlem, but silence travels faster. By the time Bumpy reached his building, people already knew, not the details, the feeling. A white-owned restaurant had drawn a line. Bumpy Johnson had chosen not to cross it with his hands. That choice carried weight. From upstairs windows, neighbors watched him enter. From stoops, men nodded. No speeches were made. No plans announced. Harlem did what it always did when it sensed. Imbalance. It leaned inward. It listened. Inside his apartment, Bumpy removed his coat and placed it carefully over a chair. He poured himself a drink he did not touch. He stood at the window and looked out at the neighborhood that had raised him, protected him, judged him, and followed him. 20-4 hours was a long time. Long enough for arrogance to settle. Long enough for assumptions to harden. Long enough for a man to believe he had won simply because nothing had happened yet. Bumpy Johnson understood time. He understood that restraint was not absence. It was preparation. Outside, the restaurant lights glowed warm against the darkening street. Inside, the owner closed his register and counted his money. Satisfied, unaware that the refusal he issued so casually had already begun working against him, Bumpy lifted his glass at last, not in anger, not in celebration, but in acknowledgement. Moment had passed. The consequence had not. The next morning, the restaurant opened on time. Eggs cracked. Coffee steamed. The griddle hissed like any other day. But something was off. Even before the first customer stepped through the door, it wasn't what had happened the night before, it was what hadn't. No retaliation. No broken glass. No bricks. Through windows. And yet, the air around the place felt wrong. Across the street, old men at a chess table didn't play. They just sat. Two barbers leaned against their shop front without speaking. No boy ran by with a newspaper. No street vendor sang out his usual just silence. The kind that knows how to wait. By noon, the first sign came. The delivery truck didn't. Stopped out the driver, a black man who usually whistled and waved, looked straight ahead and kept going. The crates of bread stayed on board. The restaurant owner stepped out, shouted after him, but the truck didn't slow. Just kept rumbling toward Lenox, like the street behind it no longer mattered. Inside the restaurant, the owner cursed. He turned to his staff, mostly black, mostly quiet, and barked out that they'd use yesterday's bread. One of the cooks nodded too quickly. Another just kept his eyes down. A second truck never came. No milk. No eggs. By 3 p.m., the cigarette machine was empty. The ice machine hadn't been fixed. The dishwasher boy had called in sick. And the usual beat cop who passed by every afternoon didn't even glance at the storefront. Harlem wasn't rioting. Harlem was watching. That was worse. Bumpy Johnson hadn't said a word to anyone about it, not officially. No meetings. No orders, but Harlem didn't need instructions. The insult hadn't been to Bumpy alone. It had been issued to every person who walked that sidewalk, spent money in that place, held dignity in a city that only occasionally allowed it, and the way Bumpy had handled it, without raising his voice, without lifting a hand that said, more than anger ever could. Harlem recognized the signal, a signal that said, if I don't need to act right now, then maybe you should. At a corner fruit stand, a woman named Mama Letty shook her head as a young man tried to explain the scene. Miss Letty, he didn't do nothin'. Just got up, paid, and left. She smiled without softness. Baby. That man's whole life is a sermon. You don't always need thunder to call the storm. By dusk, the restaurant's usual hum had vanished. Where once there were crowds, now just empty booths. The waiter who'd refused Bumpy Johnson scratched at his apron, glanced toward the clock too often, avoided the owner's gaze. He didn't like the way people looked at him now. Not with fear. Not with hatred. Just disappointment as if he'd embarrassed them all. Meanwhile, in the Harlem haberdashery 2 blocks away, Bumpy Johnson stood quietly while a tailor adjusted the shoulder of his new coat. The shop was empty except for the old jazz playing low in the background and a few regulars who nodded but didn't speak. "You hear about the diner?" the tailor asked, barely above a whisper. Bumpy didn't look up. "I was there." The man nodded. "Place is empty now." He paused, then added, "You want me to say anything to folks?" Bumpy finally turned. "Say what you want," he said. "Just don't say my name." That was his rule. No bragging. No boasting. Power wasn't in the telling. Power was in the knowing. Late that night, a meeting took place in the back room of an old church, one of those unofficial gatherings Harlem did best. A deacon, a school teacher, a numbers runner, and a club singer sat at a worn table with one empty chair left open. Not for Bumpy, for the weight he carried. "This ain't about pride," said the deacon, folding his hands. "It's about weather. Our children can walk into a place and be treated decent." The teacher nodded. "That owner thinks he can divide us. Make one man kneel to make 10 others feel better." "He misread the room," the club singer said. "And he forgot the rooms in Harlem. They didn't vote, didn't plan violence. They just made a few quiet decisions. The next day, the numbers stopped running through that block. Not out of fear, out of respect. The shoe shiner set up shop 1 block over. The preacher at the corner church shifted his food drives away from that side of the avenue. Mothers told their kids not to take the long way home anymore, not past that place. Not until it remembered who it served. And all of it happened without Bumpy saying another word, because Harlem didn't need speeches to move. It just needed to feel what was right. And what had happened in that restaurant wasn't. On the 3rd morning, the owner finally walked into the back alley and lit a cigarette with shaking fingers. The bread still hadn't come. The kitchen boy had quit. A pipe had burst and the plumber wouldn't return his call. And worst of all, no one had thrown a brick. He would have understood a brick. He would have called the police, maybe made a headline. But this was different. This was invisible. This was Harlem's version of justice, and it didn't need to shout. It just needed to stop helping you. And once it stopped, there wasn't much left. In his apartment, Bumpy read a newspaper without flipping the page. He didn't look pleased, didn't look angry, just aware. His daughter walked past, noticed the look, and asked, "You gonna do something?" He looked at her, calm as always. Already did. He hadn't broken a window. He'd reminded a city that respect wasn't begged for, it was remembered, and Harlem was remembering. By the 4th morning, the owner of the restaurant started doing the math. Not financials. Those were already bleeding. He was calculating something deeper, less tangible. Something no ledger could show, but every instinct warned him was happening. The problem wasn't the loss of product. It was the loss of momentum. No customers meant no noise. No noise meant no protection. He'd built his confidence on a lie, one he didn't even know he was telling himself. The belief that Harlem tolerated him because he was necessary. But now, the truth was revealing itself slowly, with precision. He had been tolerated because Bumpy allowed it. And now? Bumpy had simply stopped. He tried calling the bread supplier again. No answer. He drove there himself. The warehouse door was open, but the clerk looked straight through him, pretending not to see. "I've been buying from you 10 years, the owner shouted. 10 years. The clerk, a thin man with heavy eyes, finally turned. Yeah, he sighed. And for 10 years, you never once said thank you. That was all. No explanation. No confrontation. Just the weight of all those years suddenly counted out loud. The owner turned and walked back to his truck in silence. By afternoon, desperation set in. He called a cousin in the Bronx and asked if he could send over a few crates of eggs and milk. The cousin agreed cautiously, but warned him, "You stir up something up there, you deal with it on your own. Don't bring Harlem to my door." The owner slammed the phone down, then he paced. Then he shouted at his employees, accusing them of sabotage, of laziness, of cowardice. But even he knew deep down that none of them had to lift a finger for this collapse to happen. All they had to do was nothing. And Harlem had mastered the art of coordinated stillness. Outside, a crowd. Formed not loud, not hostile. Just present. Men leaned on mailboxes. Women stood with bags from the market. No one entered. No one left. They weren't protesting. They were observing, and the longer they stood there, the heavier it felt inside. The staff moved slower. The kitchen burned things. The register jammed. Everything that once worked like muscle memory now stuttered under the weight of unseen eyes. The waiter, the same one who had denied Bumpy, stood near the kitchen door, smoking nervously. His hands shook. His shirt clung to him. "You think he'll come back?" one of the line cooks asked. The waiter didn't respond. He stared at the wall. Then he muttered, "He doesn't have to." Across town, in a quiet room above a pool hall, Bumpy Johnson sat with two men from Philadelphia visiting for business, not drama. But they'd heard. They always heard. "So," one said, lighting a cigarette, "that thing at the restaurant." Bumpy didn't flinch. "Handled." The other man chuckled. "Funny. We ain't seen nothing on the news. No fires, no shootings." Bumpy poured himself tea. "You only light a fire," he said, "when you want people to see smoke." He sipped. "Slowly. But sometimes you just turn the heat up quiet and let the kitchen sweat." The two men exchanged looks. One of them raised his glass slightly. "To Harlem," he said. Bumpy didn't raise his in return. He just looked out the window. To him, Harlem wasn't a toast. It was a responsibility. Back at the restaurant, things broke in strange ways. Lights flickered for hours before the electric company finally said, "Must be internal." The sink overflowed twice. A crate of eggs the cousin had sent cracked in transit, and half were spoiled. The grease trap clogged. Every problem small. Every fix delayed. Every solution harder than it should have been. At 6 p.m., the owner did something he never thought he'd do. He walked outside, not to smoke. To speak. To someone. Anyone. But when he opened the door, the eyes turned to him like they'd been waiting. Calm. Cold. Patient. He cleared his throat. "I got no problem with anybody," he said. "But I got rules. This place has always had rules." A woman in the crowd raised an eyebrow. "Rules?" she asked. "Or habits?" He flinched. No one moved. No one responded. He wasn't being threatened. He was being measured. A reporter from the Amsterdam News stopped by late that evening. A young woman with a notebook pen and that posture that meant she already knew the story. "You own this place?" she asked. He nodded. She flipped to a blank page. "Can I ask why you refused service to Mr. Johnson?" The owner straightened. "He didn't belong here." She scribbled something. "And how do you define who belongs?" He paused. That was the trap. He could feel it. She looked up. "You ever heard of power without noise?" He didn't respond. She closed her book. "That's what you're up against. You didn't just insult a man. You tried to redefine a neighborhood. And Harlem doesn't like being redefined." She left. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning the first piece of graffiti appeared, just a single line, scrawled in white paint across the side wall. Respect is served here, or I send tea. Nothing vulgar. No threats. Just a reminder. He stood in front of it for a long time. Later that day, his landlord called. Not to ask about rent. That was paid, but to mention that another tenant, an influential tailor, had inquired about the space. Just keeping my options open, the landlord said casually. You understand. The owner hung up without answering. His hands were shaking again. But it wasn't fear. It was recognition. The thing he'd miscalculated wasn't just Bumpy Johnson's reach. It was Harlem's memory. He had believed that respect was something he could deny at the door like a menu item. He didn't understand it was the foundation of every brick on the block. Now it was gone, and everything else was following. By midnight, the restaurant was closed. Not officially. Just empty. The lights were off. The stools stacked. The register silent. No signs. No apology. No redemption arc. Just a man standing alone behind a glass door, staring at a city that had quietly decided to move on without him. And in the distance, barely visible from the restaurant window, a figure crossed the street in a dark coat and hat. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. His silence had already spoken, and Harlem had answered. The 24 hours that followed were not loud. They were deliberate. Still. Calculated. Bumpy Johnson didn't speak. He didn't signal. He didn't send anyone. That was the message, because when a man like Bumpy says nothing, everyone listens harder. In the early morning, the wind moved down 139th like it carried news. The sidewalks were clean. The corner was quiet. And the block where the restaurant stood still locked, still hoping, felt heavier by the hour. People passed by, slow and observant, not curious. Confirming. That the silence was holding, that the consequence was still coming, that Harlem hadn't forgotten. Inside his apartment, Bumpy sat at the small table by the window. Not reading, not working. Just present. The kind of presence that made the walls feel fuller. The kind of presence that required nothing to be done to be felt. Mame, his wife, walked in and poured coffee. She didn't ask about the restaurant. She just set the cup down and said, You remember what Mr. Powell said last year? Bumpy nodded once. Respect ain't a loan, Mame smiled. And Harlem ain't a bank. She kissed his shoulder and left him with his thoughts. By mid-morning, the tension had reached even the most distant corners of the block. The man who shined shoes outside the barbershop stopped setting up. The man who sold newspapers walked past the restaurant without dropping a stack. The liquor store delivery didn't arrive. Each action small, each one calculated, not because Bumpy ordered it, because Harlem understood. This was not about vengeance. It was about weight. And weight, when distributed evenly, could silence even the most arrogant man. At the restaurant, the owner wiped down the counter even though it was clean. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. He kept looking toward the door like someone owed him a rescue. The staff didn't speak much anymore. They worked like prisoners, quiet, internal, unsure where loyalty ended and survival began. The waiter had stopped making eye contact altogether. In his gut, he felt it first. The thing no one had said, that maybe it wasn't about Bumpy. It was about what Bumpy meant. Across town, a young boy named Eddie was told not to walk past the restaurant that day. He asked why. His grandmother answered, with a whisper, because silence is doing its work. Eddie didn't understand fully, but he watched, and what he saw was this: people weren't avoiding the place. They were surrounding it. With silence, with stares, with distance, and somehow that felt louder than shouting ever could. At the office, of the Amsterdam News, an editor looked over a short unsigned editorial that had been slipped under the door. It wasn't newsworthy. It didn't name names, but it said this: when you deny a man like Bumpy Johnson a seat at your table, you don't remove him. You remove yourself from business, from respect, from the city that held you up longer than you deserved. Harlem doesn't destroy, it disconnects. The editor read it twice, then ran it for the evening edition. As the day passed, word spread farther. Other establishments checked their tone. Politeness increased. Posture softened. Suddenly, servers smiled wider. Doors opened quicker. It wasn't fear. It was awareness. Because in Harlem, dignity was not optional. And when someone powerful exercised restraint, that restraint carried further than violence ever could. Back at Bumpy's apartment, an old friend stopped by, a minister. Black coat. Tired eyes. One hand on a walking cane. You stirred a pot, he said. I didn't stir, Bumpy replied. I just didn't drink. The minister sat, looked out the window. You know what happens next, Bumpy nodded. I ain't worried about what happens. He sipped his coffee. I'm watching who remembers. By sunset, the restaurant was still open, but no one went inside. The smell of food couldn't cover the scent of consequence. Even the owner knew it now. He'd misread the entire map, he thought Bumpy. Johnson's power came from fear, but fear fades. Respect lingers, and now he'd been locked out of something money couldn't buy back. He looked at his hands. They were shaking again, not from cold, from the truth that a man had sat in his booth, spoken no threat, raised no voice, and in 24 hours had shifted the entire rhythm of the block. Outside, a teenager walked by with his hands in his pockets. He paused, looked through the window, and gave the owner the faintest nod, not friendly, not mocking, just confirmation. We see you, and more importantly, you don't see us anymore. 20-4 hours. No fires. No headlines. No speeches. But Harlem had made its decision, and Bumpy never had to say a word. It ended the way power always ends in Harlem. Quietly. No parades, no victories, no apologies. Just a shift, subtle, permanent, and seen by everyone who mattered. It was just past noon when the restaurant door creaked open again. No customers, no deliveries, just the owner, sleeves rolled up, standing behind the counter, waiting. He'd sent the staff home, told them it was a maintenance day, but that was a lie. He wasn't fixing anything. He was bracing for something he didn't understand. At exactly 12:17 p.m., the door opened again. Bumpy Johnson stepped in. Alone. No entourage, no threat. He moved like the air had made room for him before he arrived. The owner looked up, lips parting as if to speak, but nothing came. Bumpy didn't stop at the counter. He walked slowly through the empty space, past the tables, past the booth. Where it started, he ran a gloved hand across the edge of the table. The wood was still chipped, still cold. He took a seat. Same place. Same posture. Hat beside him, hands folded. The owner stood frozen behind the counter. Coffee, Bumpy said softly. Just that. No more. The owner hesitated. Then moved. 1 cup. No sugar, no cream. Set down gently. No eye contact. Bumpy took a sip. Silence. The moment stretched, not threatening, not performative, just real. Then Bumpy looked up. Still think I don't belong here? He asked, voice calm. The owner's hands tightened on the counter edge. No, he whispered. You've always belonged. Bumpy said nothing, because he didn't need the man's words. He needed the room to remember what they meant. From across the street, the same old men watched from their bench. One of them nodded slowly. The boy Eddie stood next to his grandmother. She leaned down, whispered, You see that? Eddie nodded. He didn't even raise his voice, she smiled. That's what real power sounds like. Inside the restaurant, Bumpy stood. Left money on the table again, the same amount as before, maybe more. Not because he owed it, but because he had already paid for that table with something greater. Respect. And Harlem had collected. As he reached the door, the owner finally spoke again. I lost a lot. Bumpy paused. Turned his head slightly. You didn't lose, he said. You learned. The door opened. The bell above it chimed. Then he was gone. For weeks after, no one really talked about that final visit. Not directly, but its echo lived. Vendors began delivering again, but with different energy. The staff returned, but they carried themselves differently. The community didn't forget, but they allowed the door to stay open, because forgiveness in Harlem didn't mean you were right. It meant you survived the lesson. And Bumpy? He never mentioned it again, not to his men, not to Mame, not even to himself. He had no interest in parading victories, because what he had built in Harlem wasn't fear, it was order. A man with true power didn't need to destroy to prove it. Simply had to walk into a room and let everyone remember what silence had done. Outside, the city returned to its rhythm, but in one small corner of Harlem, a booth near the back of a restaurant stayed untouched for weeks, not because it was marked, because it had been witnessed, and that was enough.